Your new book, The Truth Machine, has a pretty interesting chapter title in there to start things off. And so I was going to jump in on that. The name of it is The God Protocol. And so I was curious to hear what that's about.
Oh yeah, that was a fun one to write because we looked into the system, the whole idea of double entry bookkeeping and what we now call triple entry bookkeeping, right? So essentially, double entry bookkeeping, which goes back sort of to the early days of, at least in the banking world, the Medici, was something that was blessed by the church. And it took that blessing, as by a Franciscan friar called Luca Pacioli, and he was able to write this manuscript that demonstrated that double entry bookkeeping was a godly exercise. And it ultimately then, the Vatican, after that point, banking became no longer this frowned upon exercise, and it took off. And the Vatican, there were 4 Medici popes, and there was basically the Vatican became the biggest bank in the world. But the point we were making is that ultimately, by putting all of our faith, this sort of concept of faith in the numbers, we were creating this problem because now we were trusting these centralized institutions who'd been blessed by the church to sort of keep track of the numbers themselves, and basically nothing changed for 500 years. And so Lehman Brothers was essentially continuing this tradition, right? The God Protocol is a concept that, it's a phrase actually taken from Nick Szabo's line, and he talks about it as being it's the third entry, right? And this is actually, and Ian Grigg talks about it as triple entry bookkeeping. So 1 debit, 1 credit, and 1 every single time into an immutable ledger that at any time, any moment in time, is a real-time record of what is this shared concept of the truth. So that's this sort of like all-important protocol. And that's basically where that phrase comes from.
And what about the title of the book in general, The Truth Machine? How did that come about?
Yeah. It's funny because I take it as a bit of a badge of honor that one of the responses I had on Twitter to it was worst title ever. And I think I know where the concern comes. And we knew that this would come. We knew it would be a little bit provocative because people think we're talking about a different notion of truth, right? They think we're talking about absolute truth. As if somehow we're saying the blockchain is going to, unpack the mysteries of the universe. We're also not saying that, the blockchain is a place in which you will not have untruths or lies. You can lie into the blockchain, but we're actually talking about something which I think is actually more useful and is sort of more fundamental. And I alluded to it in my presentation. That is this process by which human beings come to a consensus around what they believe to be the truth, right? Yuval Harari tells us that that's the mechanism through which, this storytelling exercise, we've built society. It doesn't really matter what is true. I know this seems like a flip thing to say, but really, who knows exactly what the GDP of the United States is, right? It's always an estimate. It's always a consensus process. So what we're saying is this is a machine that allows us, in a much more reliable, consistent, and rapid way, to arrive at consensus. And with that, we can now have this shared notion of the truth. And it's fundamentally important for the process of how we go about exchange and ultimately building civilization.
Fantastic. So you are, a senior advisor over at the Digital Currency Initiative at MIT. So what's happening there? Like, what is actually happening with that initiative?
Yeah, good question. So the DCI is, I think I'd say there's twofold, maybe three missions here. One of the most important is the belief that we need to scale this technology. And if we look back and think about it as if it's the early days of the internet, where there has to be work on building out the base protocols and so that we can have reliability, security, and ultimately scalability, then this is an important mission that a university can play. A neutral body that is helping to develop standards and to sort of develop base level open source, open access protocols. So we have, for example, Taj Dryja, who was the co-author of the Lightning white paper. And some people think it's the most important white paper since Satoshi's. And it's this second layer solution to the scaling problem of Bitcoin, trying to open payment channels and allow people to more freely trade so that you're not stuck with the 7 transactions a second limit that it has. And it's a very exciting, now that we have SegWit embedded into lots of Bitcoin apps and users, you can now effectively build this Lightning Network on top of it. That's one thing. We've got a guy working on digital fiat currency who was formerly at the Bank of England and led their digital currency initiative there. He's communicating with central banks on how we might build a protocol that is based on the open access principles of Bitcoin and the like, as something that central banks may or may not want to use. So we're trying to build a sort of a first principles open access system for digital fiat currency. And then there's guys like me who are, on the one hand, involved in sort of broad public education about what this means, but also trying to deal with the more consumer-facing or at least public-facing application layer solutions. I myself am very interested in microgrids and how the blockchain can play this important coordinating role for distributed energy systems, and also unlocking collateralized finance and sort of much more easy access to finance on the top of those sorts of systems. And then the other push that we have is we really care about diversity. So I was pleased to see you mention the efforts that you guys are doing to sort of expand the inclusion into this tent. We think that's something that we can be an important voice for.
Right, yeah, so in terms of ecosystems, the best thriving ecosystems have lots of diversity.
Right.
So it comes from ecology, actually.
Absolutely. Now, this is actually a very strong view that we hold, and I hold personally. I wrote about this just recently for CoinDesk in a somewhat provocative column. I really believe, as much as Bitcoin, any of these open source protocols are open source, the reality is that because there is a very narrow set of developers who have commit access and who are the ones that are actually really working on it, even though they are as well intended as possible, you end up with this sort of narrow value set. And I made this a point in my presentation as well, is that I think community values and what we care about need to be working their way into these systems. And so part of that is the diversity of the tokens, I think, is important. But another part of it is making sure that there is a diverse representation of human beings in the development, and it's not just the software development, it's also the entire ecosystem, as you say. It's the regulation, it's the voices, it's the conversation. It needs to be as diverse as possible. I thoroughly believe that.
Speaking of regulation, what do you think?
All right, so I'm sympathetic to the SEC because I do believe, and I hope I'm not upsetting too many people here, but I think the conversation has moved a little bit that we can be honest about this. So many of these ICOs were indeed securities issuances, right? I think there was actually probably some bad legal advice that came down at some point because people weren't thinking through if you just look at the reality of it, surely there was this expectation of profit. It looks pretty much like it's meeting the Howey test. What really worries me about what the SEC is doing, though, is that it's unlike, say, the CFTC and others that are being much more nuanced and saying, look, we need to encourage innovation regardless of our need to protect consumers and investors. The SEC's moved from being more open-minded to sounding more draconian. And we're seeing some of these deals being pulled right now. Stream just ended their airdrop. And an airdrop shouldn't be of concern because they're not selling anything. I think their messaging is off right now and potentially killing the broader prospect of a utility token. I think the SEC needs to come clean and say, okay, we do accept that at some point, once we transition to this network effect and we build out the product, the utility token is a viable concept because people are just running scared. And I don't think that's constructive. I think all the innovation is going to go offshore. US investors are going to get locked out of this. So, we have, as I said in my presentation, an enormous opportunity to rethink the way we manage the global economy with this very technology. We are grappling with some profoundly important changes here. And it worries me that the SEC is treating it with the sort of mindset of a securities market regulator and not thinking about all these nuances. So, I worry that if anything else, they could just be clearer. They need to approach this differently than they would do their normal approaches to this thing.
Excellent. Well, with that being said, we are indeed out of time. So thank you so much for joining us and
Thanks, Brinkley.
all of your insights.
All right.